So this is a conversation about where we stand in terms of protecting our electoral process for 2020 and really beyond. So I want to start with a poll, so please get out your phones if you don't have them out. And I want to ask this question of the audience, which is whether you think the big tech companies have done enough to ensure the safety of the 2020 election. So here are your choices. Yes, basically. They've done something. They've not done enough. And most of the changes aren't really sufficient. Okay, so no one's actually saying yes. Okay, all right. So we're going to come back to that topic. I want each of you to be thinking about that. But I want to just go over a little bit of where we are today, or where we're coming from, what happened in 2016. And we have some data points that we assembled that we wanted to just show you to give a sense of what might have happened, what did happen in the 2016 election. So if we can see that chart. So this will show you basically. So you can read this as well as I can, but you can see that 1 in 3 Americans received Russian-backed content on Facebook. The number of posts that were created by fake Russian-backed pages. We were talking about this backstage, an interesting detail was that at one point there was a campaign created targeting black voters that asserted that basically both candidates were racist, so don't vote for anybody, which was not about necessarily persuading someone to vote for Donald Trump or for Hillary Clinton, but to stay home. And then we have a couple other details of data that we can look at here. So 36,000 Russian link bots were tweeting between September 1st and November 15th in 2016. So you can just see the scale of what we're talking about here. And a couple of pieces of news today. Facebook agreed to pay a whopping £500,000 fine to the UK over the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which we'll be talking to Brittany about. And from January through March of this year, Facebook says it disabled 2.2 billion fake accounts. Think about that. Think how many that is. So that, I think, leads us to this question of, are we prepared for the 2020 election? Each one of these folks brings, I think, a unique and different point of view. You could call this a kind of eclectic panel, or one carefully curated to bring different points of view along some key areas. Bradley, yes. Your mission at this moment in time, among them, is to increase voter participation, and specifically using technology. But how do you answer? Where do we stand as we head into the 2020 election?
Yeah, I mean, right now we have a system that's fundamentally broken in 2 different ways, right? One is it's just totally insecure, right? I mean, I think that when people talk about threats of things like, Facebook interference or Cambridge Analytica, they don't even realize just how the basic election systems themselves are so weak. Like when I ran my Bloomberg's campaign in 2009, literally the way that we got the votes is like, the old lady in the precinct in Queens would call into the board election and be like, Bloomberg 242, Thompson 123, and that was it, right? And if she had flipped it, that would have been it, right? And so I think the first problem is the government does a really terrible job. The second problem, of course, is the platforms are only making it significantly worse. And then on top of that, we have a democracy that's completely dysfunctional because nobody actually votes. And as a result, there's total polarization. So it's a mess in every way.
Right. So Brittany, you are in a unique position, obviously, to speak to this topic since you worked with Cambridge Analytica. You were one of the folks who helped sell the Cambridge Analytica program to the Trump campaign. I recall at one point you told me you had a key to the Breitbart embassy, which I always found. Do you still have it? Could you
No,
get in if you went
thank
over?
God.
Okay. And actually this week your book, Targeted, was released, which is a story of kind of your own experience and what you saw happen with Cambridge Analytica and what could happen again.
Yes.
So your 30,000 view take, are we better off than we were in 2016? And is that good enough?
I'm not sure that we've really learned enough about all of the problems of 2016. Otherwise, I don't think Mark Zuckerberg would have made the decision, a policy decision for Facebook, that politicians are not going to be policed in the same way that you and I are. We have community standards. We're not allowed to incite violence. We're not allowed to make comments that are racist or sexist. We're not allowed to engage in voter suppression. Yet somehow our politicians are now being allowed to. That decision is one of the most difficult ways for us to actually make a change ahead of 2020. And I think Facebook concentrating on foreign intervention is really looking in the wrong direction. If you saw some of the statistics you put up, foreign intervention in our elections only costed a couple $100,000 in political ads. And those should have never been allowed to be placed. It's illegal for non-Americans or non-American institutions to advertise. But hundreds of millions of dollars, perhaps in the billions, was spent by domestic political actors, 501c3s and C4s, PACs and super PACs, let alone the campaigns themselves. So we don't actually have oversight over what these campaigns are saying, and I can tell you, I have evidence they used voter suppression tactics, they used weaponization of hatred in order to stop people from going to the polls, and we are not safe from it happening again.
Right. So Yasmin, in the work that you do at Jigsaw, you're really studying habits of people and how people are targeted, how people in a different context can be radicalized, for example, how to reach those people before they become radicalized. But in this space of looking at how people can be influenced to do something or to not do something, as Brittany said, you know, where do you think we are in 2020 versus where we were in 2016?
So I'd say that our defenses are better and the threat is more sophisticated. I think it's worth so yesterday was the 50th anniversary of the creation of the internet. The internet turned 50 yesterday. And one of the kind of godfathers of the internet, a guy called Vint Cerf, said when they designed the internet, it was unfathomable to them that you would need passwords. Because they were like, we're just sharing information. What could possibly go wrong? And that is basically the premise of the foundations of the internet. So it's fundamentally insecure because it wasn't designed for the types of threats that we see today. And I remember in late 2016, early 2017, where my team was one of the first to spot the activity of the Internet Research Agency. And we were discussing it internally, and the discussion was, well, this doesn't really feel like a cyber attack. It doesn't feel like a digital threat on par with phishing or malware. And actually, phishing, when it first became a practice, common practice online, wasn't perceived to be a threat on par with malware. And now, state-sponsored disinformation, this notion of foreign election meddling through manipulating social media, we all understand that that isn't a national security threat. So looking to 2020, the question mark for me is, are we, in late 2020, early 2021, going to say, well, domestic disinformation doesn't really feel like on par with state-sponsored cross-border election meddling. And then we're going to realize that actually we should have taken that threat equally seriously today. So we shall see.
Right. So Tom, you're in the position of being able to look at this issue from having been in the government. You were the Homeland Security Advisor to Donald Trump, to President Trump. You also served in the Bush administration, and you've been in this field and looking at these issues. So you know with real information, have we taken important steps to protect ourselves in 2020 or not?
Yeah, we have, but kind of buckle up because it's just about to get started in a bigger and larger scale, in my view. So the lessons we've learned here, Russia seem awfully antiquated and will seem really antiquated the next time we get together on this couch and talk about this again. So we saw some evidence of search result and data mining in the Obama campaign, and they used it to some effect, maybe for suppression or turnout, probably for turnout in their instance. We saw all of this foreign influence, no kidding, to socially engineer on platforms designed to allow us to socially engineer our lives. So the trend that we will see when we look back on this 2020 election is the entrance of China, the entrance of Iran, the entrance of North Korea, the entrance of maybe 10 or 12 nation-state actors that are highly, highly sophisticated, and they'll benefit from the less sophisticated actors. So at this stage, we talked about backstage the Africa Facebook release where
Yes.
it looked like the Russians were significantly involved in Africa, trying, some say, to up their game, others say that was kind of a
That
weird-
was just revealed.
that was just revealed today, kind of breaking news here on Bloomberg, right? But what we'll see as we look back on 2020 is that our social media platforms will be exploited by actors that have never previously really entered into that space. And then, interestingly, we'll have to discern their intentions. A lot of time has been spent trying to determine at what point Putin and his team shifted their desires away from Hillary and into Trump and this and that. You know, not surprisingly, President Xi will probably vote for the socialist candidate, and Putin will vote for the anarchist, and we'll end up having to decide, you know, who was more effective, and all the other nation states in between. So we'll talk about prescriptions later, but I think it's about to get worse.
So I just have to ask you, since you did come out of the Trump administration, is there any evidence that Ukraine was the true actor in hacking the DNC, and that there's a DNC server hiding somewhere in Ukraine?
Yeah, I got in a little trouble on this, but I'm pretty glad I did recently on ABC. And you know, no, I guess the real answer to your question is there's no credible evidence. Right. So there's a conspiracy theory. Everyone has its origin. In this case, it was a credible senior Ukrainian official that gave some indicators that there might be something there, and of course there wasn't. And of course our intelligence community used tools and methods and sources that aren't available to the public at large, and so it's a perfect storm. The conspiracy theory suggests one thing, we can disprove it, but we can't publicly disprove it with all of the details necessary. And so I'm here to tell you again, I don't know if it makes news or not, that is a completely debunked theory. Now that said, I know that's politically charged. The source that I would point to, because looking to sources is going to be one of the prescriptions we all end up giving as you sort through what you can and can't trust in the upcoming year and a half and beyond, is not the classified or declassified public version of the intelligence community report. That's good if you have time to read it. But it's the indictment of the 12 GRU military agents or officers that actually carried out the hack. So, you know, if you believe that there's some kind of conspiracy afoot, right? Either the indictment, which is powerful and detailed and survives our reasonable doubt standard, is wrong, or the conspiracy theory that the DNC server has been parroted away to Ukraine is wrong. And I contend that it's a no-brainer.
So why does our president not believe the way you believe?
Yeah. I'm not entirely certain if he does not believe that. Although the other question would be then, why does he say it occasionally? There's a really difficult, I think, place for him to navigate in public rhetoric. I don't condone it, but it's a bit frustrating. I know people around him say it more often than he does, where he wants to navigate the sweet spot of being perceived as a legitimate president, elected duly by people who had their own mind and made their own decision, and can't quantifiably have been proven to be influenced in any way. Maybe there was suppression, to your point, but I don't think there's any quantifiable change in people's minds on the ticket. And the notion that somehow the whole election was cast into doubt by this attempt by the Russians. So I think he's been trying to navigate that from day one, and I think those that don't like him have been trying to exploit that difference, and those that do like him have been trying to overstate that difference, and he's ended up in the middle on a number of occasions trying to keep a bright line. He's a pretty good brander. He's a pretty good marketer. And I think he's trying to market himself as a legitimate president, which he is. He was duly elected. And he's trying to refute those that suggest he's not.
So, Yasmin, when you speak about or think about the potential for domestic threats or domestic actions, what might that entail? I mean, what are you thinking about? And then how would we counter something like that? Can it be countered?
Well, it's interesting that Tom mentioned the revelation today about the covert Russian-backed disinformation activity in Africa, because they were really starting to understand that the domestic disinformation is much more difficult to detect and to prosecute. So the way that they were working was through local Africans who they tasked with setting up a website, news website or social media accounts. And that's what makes it so thorny. To what extent are we going to require that Americans reveal their real identity when they're speaking about politics online? And what are the red lines that we can establish a priori to prosecute bad activity? But the Russians are ironically engaging in domestic disinformation in Africa, and there's every motive for domestic actors to engage in it. There was a report that came out this year by the Oxford Internet Institute where they, I don't know what you would guess would be the number of countries where the government or a political party is engaging in disinformation activities. It's 70 countries, which is basically like, I think this is the risk that if we don't all, as tech companies, as politicians, come forward and say, this is our commitment, this is the standard we'll hold ourselves to. I think like in this debate, everyone's kind of like, I'll tell you what this guy should be doing and this guy should be doing, and we need to come forward and say that this is the standard that we'll hold ourselves to. We're going to have a race to the bottom, and that's what we're seeing around the world in countries like Ukraine and the Philippines, where it's been professionalized and privatized and democratized.
So, Bradley, you've been a political consultant. As you mentioned, you ran Mike's last campaign for mayor. But now you're a venture capitalist, and you're also working in this space through your foundation to expand voter activity, voter participation through technology.
Yep.
Does the environment that we're in today, in which there is a lot of suspicion about online activity, there's concern about security, we've seen enormous hacks, does that make your job harder to get mobile voting, for example,
Sure, I mean,
adopted?
it does for two reasons. One is because I think people aren't that familiar with all the vulnerabilities in the system today. So when I talk about voting over blockchain, they say, oh, here's risk, here's this risk there, and not really recognizing, like, we couldn't even count paper ballots in Florida in 2000, right? So there's risk everywhere. But beyond that, I mean, I think that we have to grapple with the fact that there's two underlying problems, and they're kind of equally severe. One is that the integrity of our elections may not be there if state-sponsored hacking, things like that take place. On the other hand, we have elections that, because districts are gerrymandered and primary turnout's about 15%, roughly 15% of this country is electing pretty much everybody, and that's why nothing can get done, right? And it's true at a federal level, but even here, when Queens says no to Amazon's 25,000 jobs, that's because 12,000 people voted in that city council race, and they are as ideological and left-wing as you can get. When Missouri or Georgia or Alabama bans abortion, same thing. You've got 15% turnout in the Republican legislative primaries, and that's the actions they take. So if you believe in politics, like I learned, that every single policy output is the result of a political input, if you want to change what happens, you got to change the inputs, and the only way to do that is to radically increase turnout. So we've all got a tool in our pockets that can allow us, through the blockchain, to vote on our phones. We've now done this, it'll be after next week, 5 different times. We've now done elections in West Virginia, Denver, Utah, and next week, Oregon and Washington State as well. So far,
With mobile app.
with a mobile app over blockchain. So far, it's been for deployed military. People in the disability community will be able to vote in Utah next week as well on their phone. They've all been audited multiple times, all come back clean. By no means is this a solution that we're going to roll out to the whole country in next November for the presidential. But if we don't solve this part of the problem, I don't think we're even one country in 25 years.
So, but beyond individual people's suspicions or reluctance to trust the technology, do you see institutional barriers to adopting widespread mobile voting?
Yeah, yes and no. So I think that anyone who does well by the current system, whether it's the NRA on the right or the NEA on the left, is not really going to want change, right? So if disproportionately low turnout, especially in primaries, is good for you, you're going to put up all kinds of barriers to change because that's what takes to lose your power. If you're a Republican congressman from Florida and turnout in your primary is 12% and NRA members are half that 12%, you're never voting for an assault weapon ban.
Right.
If turnout is 60, 70%, then just based on the math, you'd be crazy not to because you would lose your seat. So anyone who that's not in their interest will sort of try to block it. And then institutions. So the state of Alaska's Democratic Party wanted to use mobile voting for the Democratic presidential primary in Alaska next year. The DNC last week said no. They couldn't really explain why they were against it, but you know, they're an
They
institution.
lost Alaska,
and,
yeah, right.
yeah, I mean, these are the same people that managed to help elect Trump in 2016. So like, you know, there's all kinds of institutional opposition, and then there's everyone. This is kind of like, in some ways, the biggest tech disruption fight of all.
Right, right. So from your position as an intelligence community official, I mean, do you think it's viable that we would have a secure mobile voting system, and do you see that happening anytime soon?
Well, you know, yeah, I think it's possible, right? The whole principle for me is to stay apolitical. So if we have an eligible voter and that eligible voter can vote once and reliably, then I'm all for it. You know, and I think that's the principle that most Americans would hold. You know, but I understand all the politics that go into it, because that evolution and change period is going to not only inject security risk, but it's going to inject all sorts of unforeseen outcomes that they can't, you know, advance. And so,
Meaning like such as what?
meaning practical partisan outcomes. There'll be counties that flip from red to blue and blue to red, and there'll be states that don't understand their current, you know, voter base well enough to predict the outcomes, and the gerrymandering and all those things. So I get all those human rules that are placed on top of it. There's a lot of promise for blockchain in places that's over-exaggerated. There's also some promise for it that's really, really underutilized. So if that applies, I haven't looked into your solution. I would imagine we'll end up there. You know, in 1996, somebody suggested that the internet wouldn't ever be used on every desk, right? And of course, yeah, we're there. So troglodytes are everywhere, but they're facing a mountain of uptake.
Right.
You can't opt out of the internet anymore. And for what it's worth, we jumped right into social kind of engineering. It's a really important, difficult to solve problem, but I'd like to foot stomp your point about accountability and responsibility. First, we have to align them, and then we have to maintain them. So a lot of people ask me, is the federal government prepared? Are we secure from a federal perspective against foreign adversaries? Because they believe it's the federal government's job, but I think there's 2,000 or so jurisdictions, in addition to state governments, responsible for, accountable for that process, that system. They run it. The federal government can't be accountable for something they're not responsible for. It kind of separates logic. Everyone here has managed things, and you know, for what it's worth, you mentioned the engineering. We all manage engineers, I think, in this room, or we are engineers in this room. It's not surprising that they didn't anticipate the social rules-based discord that would come from their linear kind of invention. But there is a security function here that goes beyond the voter machine. And so just to throw that out there and not be self-serving, right? You know, Trinity Cyber's got game against a lot of this, so we sell ourselves. But the notion of securing the DNC, not a state-run entity,
Right.
and that those emails stolen and released weren't falsified. They were just embarrassing and released at the right time to achieve a certain result, is going to apply to a broader audience this time around, right? And so Bloomberg and media outlets on that election night, to the point you made, Bradley, are going to have to be very careful and diligent that their systems aren't compromised in ways they can't understand, and that they don't then inject discord into our entire country by misreporting something that then gets cast into question. If I were a foreign adversary, I would get into the rolls or get into a one voter machine, not diffuse my efforts. I would spend all my time trying to have one individual success and then plant the suggestion that maybe I had that success everywhere, and make everybody disprove the negative and watch the media kind of go nuts with that. So there's going to have to be a lot of accountability and responsibility appropriately placed. People are going to have to start taking actions that I don't see them taking sufficiently right now, from newsrooms to bedrooms to tally houses. I think no kind of swing state right now is in jeopardy of not having a paper backup, which is, I think, what we all want. But there are a few states, not swing states, fortunately, that aren't there yet. And I don't think they'll get there by 2020. So we'll have probably 2 to 5 states in this union that don't have a paper backup. And if the day and the time comes that there's a vote question at the tally box, they won't be able to evidence any reliable backup.
Right.
And I'm not looking for a receipt on my vote, but I'm looking for some backup.
Right. So on this topic of responsibility and accountability, Brittany, when you and I were talking about what we would talk about here on stage, Mark Zuckerberg was announcing the changes that they were making at Facebook, which of course you were quite keen to hear and study, given what you were working with and leading up to the 2016 election. So has Facebook, has any major tech company accepted that responsibility, and are we holding them accountable enough? And if not, how do we do that?
So, one, I don't think that they've made the investments that they need to. The fact that only the week before last, Facebook started talking about foreign elections intervention again. This has been still going on since November 2016, and a lot of the elections for next November have still been going on every single day. There have been super PACs that are related to the Trump campaign that have been running since Cambridge Analytica was still running them in 2016, and some of the same tactics are still being used. And that's why I can't stress enough the fact that Facebook is concentrating on foreign elections intervention and not domestic threats is a massive threat to our democracy in and of itself. The amount of money that goes through these 501c3s and C4s and the data that they are using in order to target people, to manipulate them, is something we still have no transparency into. So if we're going to talk about using blockchain for elections, that's for tracking and traceability. That's something I 100% believe in. But we still have not figured out the basics. We don't have tracking and traceability of the data that is held on us by these companies and why they are targeting us with specific ads. So you're going to see something very different than I do on my Facebook feed, on my Twitter. And that's because our data is different, and perhaps it shows that I'm a Joe Biden supporter, and I will never vote for a Republican, so therefore, if I get shown enough negative Joe Biden ads, I might not go to the polls at all. It's not going to switch me to being a Trump voter.
Right.
And unfortunately, political organizations like the one that I used to work for have enough data about us that they can tell this, and therefore they're going to only spend money on me if they think that they can get me to not vote, because they're not going to change me into a supporter of their candidate.
I think that's a really good point. I think a lot of people think of interference as persuading me to vote for someone, and I think persuading someone who was going to vote for Hillary to vote for Trump seems unlikely, right?
Quite.
Right.
And
vice versa, right? I mean, if anything, people are very fixed in their views about the candidates in 2016. You gave me a really good example, though. Well, let me go back. In the clip from The Great Hack, the Netflix show that you're in, you were shown talking about persuadables. But there was another category, right, of people that you had a term for them to depress the vote.
It's called deterrence.
Right.
And that means to deter people from going to vote. Because if your data shows that you will only vote for somebody's opponent, then the only way for them to actually have a win with you is for you not to go and vote in the first place. They're not going to sway your opinion on issues or on candidates.
But how do we know that was the intention, that suppressing that vote was actually what was going on, or just negative advertising?
Right.
The Trump campaign and the Trump super PAC, led by David Bossert of Citizens United and Cambridge Analytica, measured their success in decrease in intent to vote for Hillary Clinton. I would say that does what it says on the tin.
Right. So where do we go from here? I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm completely depressed.
I'm not, which is kind of shocking probably. I'm an eternal optimist, and I do think that we have a lot of solutions. It's not just a legislative and regulatory fix. Technologists are the ones that really need to solve these problems, but unfortunately we've seen that companies like Facebook are not going to make the ethical decision unless they are forced to. So if any of you in this audience that are listening to this have not called your legislator lately, call them, email them. They might not respond, but what they do is they count the fact that you have written in and you say, I'm afraid ahead of 2020 that my data is not protected, that technology companies are not making the right decisions in order to protect our vote and our elections, and I want you to do something about it. There's a lot of incredible legislators that have put forth legislative and regulatory frameworks that can protect us, and I'm sorry, we're really not going to be protected in time for 2020 fully, but we need to think about the rest of our future. What are our kids and our grandkids going to experience if we let our democracy crumble today?
You said something to me when we were talking about, how protected are we in 2020, and you gave me your answer, and I was like, wait, that's it? That's how protected we are? Yeah. Tell them what you told me about where things stand.
I'm not sure how much more negative I can be. I have a fairly positive view as well, although I'm very concerned about what you just said right there, and not because you said it, but because we've now defined the problem in 3 different ways on this panel. and it's very difficult to have a solution to 3 or 4 different problems. So we're going to have to first come to a common agreement on what problem it is we're trying to solve. Domestic campaigns endeavoring to change our mind or influence our desire to go vote, is as old as the Republic and older. And there's nothing inherently wrong with it. And so to hold our companies to a standard that they prohibit that is to put them in a position that will be almost untenable. So it's at this stage for me a foreign adversary issue, because that's what seems to unite Americans, that we don't want to be divided, manipulated, or even communicated with anonymously by a foreign entity because it's none of their business and so on. What I think, though, is that 2020 is about short-term actions and not long-term solutions. I think that's probably what I said to you on the pre-interview, but
you said find a reputable news source like Bloomberg. Stick with that.
Well,
Did he say like Bloomberg?
He did.
I did, in fact. So the idea here, ABC News, the idea is that we're going to have to find curated media sources who are under a different regulatory standard, to Brittany's point, that are held liable for not fact-checking things in a way that they're able to sustain in their business model, and look to them to do some of the work that we don't have time to do in terms of the underlying factual investigation. So that's one of the short-term solutions. I'm afraid otherwise trying to suss out the intention of a person that doesn't reveal their intent but tries to nevertheless influence your thinking on social media is virtually impossible. And given that I started with, and I'll end with, my prediction that other countries are entering this election cycle with large investments, I think it'll become harder and if not impossible.
Yasmin, we're running out of time, but your take on what we do, and are you an optimist about this?
I am an optimist.
Really?
Okay. Yes. I think that we need to look at networked activity, which hopefully will help us spot the foreign adversaries. And the companies are becoming quite good at figuring out what the signals are of when accounts are behaving in unison, or when messages are being transmitted in a way that's inorganic. They have algorithms that are pretty smart to that. And then we need to come forward and say, what's the substance of posts that we are saying is a threat? Personally, I mean, lie or not lie, that's really thorny, but misinformation about where to vote.
Sure.
About like how you can vote, around the census issues also. We need to come forward and say what's not permissible, and also what the bar is that we expect from our politicians. But I'm an optimist.
Mm-hmm. Bradley, you're going to keep pushing this initiative forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if we don't increase turnout, all of this is for naught either way, and it's only going to happen if we enable technology. It's got to happen securely, otherwise it's not worth doing at all. But as these really smart people are kind of figuring out what the security should be, I'll keep trying to create a world where it's at least possible for people to vote over their phones, and one day we can have a world where elections are both secure and widely participated in.
All right, thank you all very much.